capitalist mode of production had its very start, let's say, in the process of European colonization of Abiyala. The first thing that the European invaders did was creating and forcing into the people an homogeneous, precisely the same kind of an homogeneous category called Indians, but a very heavy and important way to destroy these societies and to change them radically was through imposing the idea that some of the people were women and were supposed to do this, and that, and some other were supposed to, not women, they were supposed to be only female. They were very animalized, and the same with men that were only considered as male and as animals.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Jules Falquet. Jules is a philosopher at Université Paris 8, where she researches and writes about materialist feminism. She joins me today to discuss the research of her latest book, Le Combinatoire Straight, The Straight Bind, in which she argues that the creation of sex, race, and class, and the production of children have imposed a social organization of work that justifies and facilitates the exploitation of human bodies. These kinds of conversations are incredibly important, not just because of what we do to one another on this planet, but also because of what we're doing to Earth. And throughout, Jules and I weave together how sexism, racism, colonialism, the impact on bodies, the way we perceive other bodies, are seen in our treatment of the planet and our more than human kin. This is a bracing and at times uncomfortable conversation in which we discuss the differences or lack of between males and females, how colonialism imposed a racial order that morally justified the enslavement and genocide of millions of people, and what it means to produce children, the many contexts within which such an act happens, the biological essentialism attached to it, which marks it as a blessing every time, and how such a thing is still presumed as a biological inevitability, or even a romantic inevitability, rather than a deeply considered choice in a world that does not particularly protect children and is certainly not looking after their future. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Jules, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Also my pleasure to have this.
So I've been experimenting with the format of the show recently, but I was thinking about it with regards to this episode, and I think it's best to stick with the original big first question, which is, Jules, why is the world in crisis?
Ooh, well, it's a very strong and with different phases crisis, but I think the main responsible might be the global capitalist mode of production, which is also colonial, racist, and heterosexist, and I think, and also ableist, and many different things, and also with a very bad conception of what other beings, let's say animal and plants and mountains and all the stuff, which are not understood properly by part of the humanity, and mainly the people in power in different ways of being in power. So this whole misconception, organization, misguidance, and mainly I think it has a name which is capitalism, somehow like being the general name for all these problems, very strong. I repeat, colonialism and its consequences, and also the oppression of women in many different ways, which is also heterosexual oppression altogether.
Excellent. And it is that altogether. Although I'm interested in what you think, because I take umbrage with using capitalism as a descriptor for all of these things, because I think it too easily allows people to essentially just focus on economics as the problem, or also just look to writers and thinkers from the 19th century, who essentially had established the theory and whose theory is still relevant, and look to them as the heroes of what this moment in time needs, when actually, as you've laid out, the problem is much, much more complex. And I just don't think the word capitalism cuts it anymore.
Well, I use it just, I'm perfectly aware that it is very limited and it could be also restrictive, but I think it's important in order to, or I use it in order to remind, and there is a historical logic or a bunch of historical logics, but it is a historical process which is
Yeah.
not forced. I mean, it's somehow contingent. It could have been different, and it still can be different. And I also want to have very much in mind the material organization of work. It's not only about economics, but it's about the organization of work, social work, in many different meanings or senses. So it's not only the salary work or the work in factories, and not only either the so-called reproductive work, is also child rearing and bearing, and it's many different, and it's also emotional work. I mean, the whole, in a very whole sense, the organization of work, which is, in my opinion, organized in a very problematic way. So three main lines. One is the class line, the other is the sex line, and the third is the racial line, which is also colonial, obviously, and has to do with migration too.
Right. We will go down that track just in one moment, because you've used the word heterosexist. And in your book, Le Combinatoire Straight, you talk about heteropatriarchy. Could you explain for listeners why you've added on that hetero prefix and how it differs from sexism or patriarchy?
Well, indeed, I think probably is the same global ID, but I use heterosexual in order. I'm not referring to sexual practices or emotions and love and da da da. I'm referring to the Wittig, Manning-Wittig's proposal or analysis, which is that heterosexuality is an undemonstrated affirmation that says that it naturally exists men and women, which is totally untrue, just as it is untrue that it naturally exists, that races naturally exist. I mean, it's a question of naturalizing oppression, different kinds of oppression, racial oppression, and sexual, sexist oppression. And so, in Monique Wittig's opinion and analysis, straight mind is an ideology which affirms, without any demonstration, that the sexual difference exists. And it is universal and all the time and everywhere. And she says, no. I mean, there are many kinds of bodies and of beings, and it's totally artificial and politically very heavy to distinguish two different groups which are supposed to be totally distinct and homogeneous, one and the other one. So the idea that they're different and that in that difference they are homogeneous each one are two forces, ideas, affirmation, which are the core of um, heterosexuality, not as a sexuality, but as a naturalist ideology. And this is the main, it's a very important point to understand, in my opinion, to be able also to understand how structural race relation function, because they are also based on this very problematic naturalization. The idea that these different groups exist, race groups or sex groups, and they're not existing in nature. Nature is also a social and cultural
Yeah.
construction, by the way, but they do not exist in biology. What exists in biology is like a whole constellation of different beings that you cannot cut, say, one and the other one. Neither white, black, neither man, woman, neither all that stuff.
But are we talking about men and women, the gender categories, or are we talking about male and female? Because whilst there is a spectrum of sex, including intersex people, um, the vast majority of the human species does fall quite neatly into either having a female reproductivity or a male reproductivity. And so what are we talking about here? Sex or gender?
We are talking about both things because actually gender is totally constructed on the naturalization of supposedly biological sex. And the question of intersexual is not a marginal question. It's a central question which helps us to understand that actually this divide is false. If you have a group, a whole group, or even a single person which contradicts the divide, it means the divide is problematic, by the way. And then about reproduction, I mean, for instance, when you are a small boy or small girl, you cannot reproduce. So why should the reproducing question be at the center of our realities, let's say? Or what do we do with um, people called women after they cannot reproduce anymore, for instance? And what about all the people who, for different reasons, choose or are forced not to reproduce themselves? So why should this kind of supposedly biological difference mean so much? Why?
Perhaps because it is maybe the only difference, really. And this is the thing, not to get I'm not a biological essentialist, but there are categories of, and I suppose we could argue that this is just how, colonial science has established it in the world, sure. But it's not that these are the most important differences and that's why we highlight it, but perhaps it is the only difference, really. How much hormones does one person have or another in their body, on which spectrum, and what attributes does it give them or otherwise? And I suppose I'm interested in, is it at all possible to separate that from the role that is given? Because we know that throughout human history, human beings have organized themselves in vastly, vastly different ways, a huge diversity of ways. And so the heterosexist form of colonial patriarchy that we exist in, which absolutely does essentialize biology and does produce gender roles and naturalizes oppression and subjugation. That's not the only way to understand the differences between males and females, because it's not the only way that human beings have organized themselves.
Well, indeed, I repeat, there is no such groups, two different biological groups as male and female. That's the point. There are many different, you can make many clearest separation between individuals than male and female. And what do you do with all the people, which are not so few, who don't enter properly into supposedly male and female? And what do you do with the very big differences that can exist between one female, let's say, and another female?
Yeah.
In strength, in health, in hate, in many physical features. So the differences inside the supposedly united group of female or male might be much more important than the supposed difference between one female and one male. And then another point, which is very important, is that social roles create the bodies in the sense that social roles and social expectation and all this question. And for instance, if you feed much less some people, let's say female, and if you allow them much less exercise, physical exercise, very quickly you're going to have people who correspond to the idea that you said female should be. They are like this because they are fed like this, they are trained like this, they are, I mean, physically, this is a very important point. And then, for instance, there are some examples of supposed male being able to produce milk, to breed. So it's a bit extremist, but it's the idea of the plasticity of the even body, a very strong plasticity. And you also know that in many culture, they cut, they put, they take away, they many features of the body because they think otherwise the body is not a proper social body. So the most important point is the social and cultural organization of any group. And then another point which might be important to remind is that biological production of children is important for a society, but it's not the main social function or the main social ability that is important. I mean, there are many other things that are important for any social group to survive. So why should we put biological production of children as the main factor, which is the reason of organization of different, groups?
But I don't think it is. I'm not sure if I'm not sure
And
apart from
but
Americans, Republican
I
Americans, if they'd be arguing that.
I mean, I have the impression that what is put into light is, and you said it, the main difference, or maybe the only big difference that would exist in humanity, is about the reproductive organs. Is it not what you said? Because it's not the sexual
Yeah,
organs, it's reproductive organs. And why do we
sure.
put so much attention on reproductive organs? Because if only one part of what human beings do to allow their own society to follow on, let's say, or to function.
Well, because we were talking about bodies, and we were talking, you were arguing that there is no difference between this spectrum of bodies, and I said, but there is. I think that there is a difference, a scientific difference between, and I just use the scientific term, the reproductive organs or not. It's not about the fact that they produce children or whatever. I mean, on a sort of material level, not an ideological one. It is, and it's not a huge difference. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm argue that there are far more differences between men and women than there are far more similarities between men and women than there are differences. And it is astonishing that such a minor difference becomes socialized as this vast chasm within which violence occurs and oppression occurs and a complete chaotic misunderstanding occurs. But I do think that it is a difference. And maybe if we just hang on, if you allow me to just keep going for a second, let's turn away from human beings, because I feel like this is kind of more emotionally loaded for people. Let's think about dogs. Let's choose most people's favorite pet, the dog. Are you arguing then that there is no such thing as male and female dogs as well?
I mean, dogs are an example, but for instance, and first of all, dogs, the kind of dogs we know are totally socially and culturally created dogs. I mean, they're reproduced by like generation and generation of
Yeah,
one,
totally.
which are quite different from
Yeah.
natural dogs.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if we look to animals, toward animals, there are quite different ways of organizing and organizing the bodies. And there are some fishes, for instance, who or which can become I mean, they are supposed to be male, and if there are not enough female, they can transform into female. And
The clownfish, yeah.
females in fishes and in birds like condors who can reproduce themselves only with females, I mean, by parthenogenesis. So, and it's not like insects, and we're talking about vertebrate beings with hot blood and all the stuff, which we consider to be a sign of something. So it's very, I mean, depending on what kind of animal or plants you consider, even the idea that reproduction is very natural and very logical. And I mean, we have a very like transformated and very problematic, very strong bias of anthropomorphism when we talk about reproduction. When you look at plants, for instance, it's totally crazy. And even when you look at hens, hens,
Yeah, hence.
they have three different sexual chromosomes. It's not the same as human beings. We are totally like, our heads are totally blurred with the idea of X and E chromosomes, which is,
Why?
yeah, it is totally specific to human beings. I mean,
Well, it's also specific to mammals, though. Like, let's not discard evolution. There was a reason I asked you about dogs, because they are a mammal, and we can talk about primates, who are our genetic cousins.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
there's because we don't belong to any genus of plants or fish. Some of them have been around on this planet for far longer than we have, and are probably just doing things more efficiently than we are. But if we take, our
People
chimp or
behave.
bonobo cousins, because they're much nicer, our bonobo cousins, would you argue that they are a very interesting example because of how they organize their society? They're non-hierarchical. If there's any sort of power, it belongs to the females. They have no kind of sexual monogamous or possessive relationships. Often they're all going about shagging each other all day long. Do they enjoy any difference of sex, or are they also on a spectrum that you would argue of where there is no definitive category of male and female?
I didn't study especially the genetics of bonobo, so and hormones and gonads and that, so I cannot be sure, but I'm pretty sure that probably also in bonobo you cannot like make this so neat and so definite divide between male and female. You can say these individuals have global characteristics respect to their sexual organs or genes or chromosomes or gonads or hormones. This you can probably say these more or less and these others. And there is a group which is more complicated. So there are three groups at least.
That's
And then
yeah.
the differences inside the group. This is the problem. Is it's not, the problem is not saying that there are physical differences. There are many physical differences. The point is, why do we give so much importance to this difference, and why do we need to base the social inequalities and the organization of power and of work and of everything on supposedly biological characteristics and rights, which are quite, they're totally informed and over determinated by what we try to justify in society and in our different cultures. That's my point. Because the same with race. Obviously, people have a certain amount of melanin. This is not, I mean, and we can say above 50 things, we will call them like this, and under 50, we'll call them like that. But this is artificial. I mean, this is a convention. This is a social convention. And then probably if we put some people more in the sunlight and the others we keep away from the sunlight, we're going to confirm that they're different. But it's a social operation, social process. I mean,
It's interesting. And I'm not going to be able to remember properly or cite her. but I was reading a Black American woman recently, and I think it might have been an essay rather than a paper. And she was talking about how race is not just a social construct because of the way that people in Black bodies respond differently to different medical treatments, in, and how that's sort of become apparent in recent years when out with the borders of Africa, where horrible experiments have been done, sort of the Western medical industry has finally started to take seriously the fact that people have, these subtle differences that actually result in big problems. And I can't remember an example off the top of my head. I think it was actually to do with things that treat the skin. But how would you respond to that then?
I know that, and it's an anti-racist struggle to have physicians and biology recognizing many differences between many different individuals and groups. But though it doesn't mean, for instance, some people of African descent have this question of the red cells, hemoglobin cells, being
Yeah,
different.
hemoglobin.
Yeah, because different from other people, because it's a sort of adaptation to malaria.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I mean, not every people from Africa has been
of
living in
course.
regions in which malaria exists, and not it is not a generalized. I mean, but for instance, in Brazil, they struggle to have this possibility of being more subject to some kind of diseases because of that, um, and have better healthcare for this question. But this is not every Black people or every people from
Mm,
African descent, and not even every African people. So obviously,
mm.
that there might exist differences. For instance, people are in the very cold zones, their bodies are smaller because the biggest you are, the more you get cold. I mean, so you can
Yeah, of course.
draw adaptations, you can draw lines of adapted groups, but this doesn't mean there is a fundamental difference that justifies a different place in the organization of work and
Okay.
represent exploitation, let's say, in clear
I
words.
think what I mean on the second clause there that justifies exploitation, we were always completely in agreement. But I think I see now the common ground. So if I may, is what you're saying that essentially there is no fundamental difference between human beings that facilitates the creation of different categories through which to understand their humanness, their humanity. At the end of the day, we are all absolutely the same when it comes to what is essential, which is that we are human and we share the quality of being human. And that should be the bottom line always. And instead, what has happened through the exploitation of resources, be they Earth's bodies, our own bodies, other humans' bodies, we have come to create these distinctions, which, as you say, justify continuing exploitation, oppression, subjugation, and the flooding of wealth to the top.
That's what I say. And I say the
Perfect.
categories are created by and to justify different kinds and different lines of oppression, exploitation, and whatever.
Gotcha. 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 Right. So we're not arguing against sort of the science of biology per se, but we're arguing against what that means.
That's it.
Voila.
That is me.
Perfect. Right. We've spent a long time on that, but I'm glad that we did because I think that this is a conversation that a lot of people sort of hear happening around them and that is often misunderstood and is often misconstrued and is often, frankly, people can't disagree for more than about 3 minutes before conversations derail. So I'm really, really, really glad that we did that. Thank you. We can now move on to perhaps the more important part of it, which is the organization of work. So, what is this connection between heteropatriarchy and colonial racism and our social organizations which dictate our roles in society? And then later, how can we do it better?
Okay, Julie. Extremely small.
I know, big question.
Well, anyway, what I can say is related with what I know a bit better, which is let's say, the part of the world which is around the Atlantic, so-called Black Atlantic, some ways. And so what I say is about, and my analysis are about what happened since the beginning of the European colonization, invasion of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is also now called Amiyayana in a decolonial way. And even though not everything started on the same day that Columbus took ground there and there, it's more complicated. But in general, I follow the work of Mariano Gomez, the Argentine philosopher who died recently, like some years ago. And she wrote about a very interesting text and many interesting things, like in the line of Peruvian sociologist called Aníbal Quijano, who Aníbal Quijano, more or less in 2000, he wrote about the fact that actually capitalist mode of production had its very start, let's say, in the process of European colonization of Abiyala, in which he says the first thing that the European invaders did was creating and forcing into the people an homogeneous, precisely the same kind of an homogeneous category called Indians. So they said, all these very different people, like thousands of different civilizations and people and bodies, we are going to call them all Indians. And we are creating a category which we will say is natural, biological, self-understandable. So we all them are Indians. And probably we doubt if they have a soul or not, probably not. And for this reason, we can have them working very hard and we can kill them if we don't succeed in convert them. Okay. And so this enforcement of a new idea of race, a modern idea of race. Because before they had some ideas of race, like being linked to religion and the question of the Jews and the Moorish people in Spain, which is a long story. But I mean, when they arrived in Abiyala, they created this new idea of race, which was like encompassing a whole continent and homogenizing a whole continent. And then, after starting a very enormous and horrible genocide, they needed more hands and workers. So they took by force, generally by force, many people from Europe, Irish people mainly, and other poor people, then from the islands like Canaria and all these islands which were on the way, and then obviously many people of Africa. And so these kind of people also became racialized progressively. This is what Piano says. Then Lugones says this is true, but at the same time, another very important enforcement was the enforcement of a new idea, precisely of gender, which modern idea, modern in sense of 5 centuries ago, uh, this enforcement of gender is to be understood as simultaneous to the enforcement of a new idea of race, and is to be understood as mainly a destruction, a very heavy, very violent destruction of what existed before, not so much in terms of this is a man, this is a woman, this is a heterosexuality, no, mainly because there were very different societies, but in a significant amount of these societies, probably for what we can know now, people that we now call women were not so oppressed as they are now, or as they are in Western countries, or as they were in European countries at the time. They could be spiritual authorities, they could be political authorities, they could be, they could have a very strong importance in their societies their societies in general, I mean, in very different ways, but many of these societies were not organized around violence necessarily, or around social inequalities or different access to the land, let's say. So there were societies quite different, but a very heavy and important way to destroy these societies and to change them radically was through imposing the idea that some of the people were women and were supposed to do this, and that, and some other were supposed to, I mean, not women, they were supposed to be only female. They were very animalized. And the same with men that were only considered as male and as animals. But this imposition of gender is a destroying of the previous organization of gender, let's say, or the previous social organization in which precisely gender was in different situation, but was probably conceived in quite a different way. And probably they didn't, I mean, in many cultures, in other, yes, but in other not, they didn't understand precisely that humankind was divided between male and female and men and women. They had another very different idea. So let's say, European invaders imposed a new way of thinking, which included the binary idea of male and female, men and men and female, men and women. Sorry, and yeah, this idea that we criticized the first part of the interview is very much linked to the imposition and to the European invasion of Abiyayala, which was concretely a totally different way of thinking many things, including sex and gender.
I actually saw something of what you're describing recently firsthand. I had the great fortune to go to the Pacific Islands, which is one of the last places in the world to have been colonized. Essentially, the Europeans only started rocking up in the 1800s. And colonization was swift, but also only lasted about 100 years. The first nation to get its independence was Samoa. And I visited Samoa, and it was just extraordinary because I'd heard that they have this different perception of sex and gender to the West, but I didn't expect to see it so much as I did. And it really revealed to me, I guess, how much the perception of a thing, the understanding of a thing, then facilitates or like creates the thing in itself. Because it's a very, very small island in the middle of the ocean, and it has very, very, very few people. There are more Samoans living outside of Samoa than within Samoa. And there, I have never seen so many gay men per square kilometer in my life, and also never seen so many trans women. And they're not actually called trans women, they're called fafafine. And they're not trans women in the way that Western culture would understand trans women, because they are this third thing. They exist in this third space. And it's men who dress as women and live as women and have romantic relationships with men, but are not women. They are fafafine. They are this extra thing, this sort of like bounty of diversity, really. And I'd heard, and I didn't think about it going in. I suppose I would have assumed, if had somebody asked me, maybe I'll see one every day. Multiple every day. And the population is so, so, so small. And it revealed to me, I guess, just like when you allow for the possibility of a thing, how much diversity just bursts through. And when you speak to Samoans about it and try and explain what's going on in the West at the moment with, the gender problem and this war between the sexes, and why people can't understand that there are more than two categories, or why somebody would want to live as a different, they're like, what? Why? Why? Or even when you ask, oh, the fafafine, that's interesting. They say, is it? Why? And it was so interesting, I think, to be able to witness that firsthand and see what colonialism sort of failed actually to erase, because the Samoan culture put up a very, very, very big fight in the Pacific.
But one important point is also, in my opinion, not only to focus on sexual practice or romantic practices. The most important thing is how work is organized in these societies. I mean, the people that from outside we would call female and woman, and the people that from the outside we would call male and men, for instance, what kind of work do they do? And is it separated? What kind of inequalities exist or don't exist? Which is the main point. And many times we just focus on sexuality, and it seems to be like an extra thing which is out of the economic basis of the society. And it's not. It's not about sexuality. It's about the whole organization of society. I mean, who is able to or who is allowed to speak with the goddess or the goddesses or the gods, who is in charge of doing what, I mean, politically speaking and economically speaking. This is the main, I mean, in my opinion, this is the main point in all that.
No, I completely agree with you. Who was allowed to take care of the medicine and use the medicine and treat people and heal people and bring people together? Who was allowed to construct the homes? Who was allowed to seed the ground for the following year? And this is what I loved about Sylvia's book, the way she classifies all of this as reproductive work. And she says in the book, women have been the backbone of reproductivity, but that doesn't have to belong to women or men. Everything that she discusses can belong to both, everyone, all humans, essentially, all together, including children, quite frankly. And so it's very interesting. It was a very interesting thing to read her study and about how this imposition of witchness was essentially to begin to undermine the power of women in their communities and the gender roles that did exist, that granted them authority, that granted them the power to essentially start rebellions on their own lands, of which they led many in Europe, and then see how that was then transplanted into Latin America, and how what you've described as this creation of the race Indian, they were then burned as witches as well, classified as witches for practicing this other knowledge. And this other knowledge, which was what kept them tied to the land and able to live off of the land without intervention from any superior, quote unquote, or higher authority. And the colonial Christians invading had to obviously destroy that. It's a completely fascinating way to understand history, I find, everything that you're describing.
And this is something that Maria Lugones says also. And I think it's important to repeat, in my opinion, that there were not women nor female necessarily. I mean, we project these only two categories, male, female, men, and women, were probably in their own understanding at the time, they were not understanding themselves as men or women or male or female. They probably had a much more extensive way of thinking to themselves. And it's not only that there were three genders instead of two. It's a question that it would not probably make sense. Not for every culture, because there were very different cultures. But part of this culture, it didn't make sense. I think it's quite difficult to admit and to fully understand what it could mean not to be so firmly convinced that male and female exist as such, or men and women exist as groups. I mean, we are so much like imbued or so much like influenced by our own system of beliefs, but it's only a system of belief. It's not reality. So for the people before European invasion, they didn't have these categories as such in mind. It's not that we came and we did this and that to women. We came and we did this and that, we, European people, to people that were seen as maybe female and women by the European people, but themselves, probably they didn't understand themselves in the categories of male and female, and they had other categories. This is the most part to understand.
I think what's and I want to caveat, and I do this with everyone on the show. Like, it's very important to not, as you've also said, like, lump all indigenous cultures together. There have been such different ways of organizing throughout the world that we can't possibly know what the whole world was like before the Europeans arrived. We could have, had we been respectful. But I think something that may be quite difficult now for people to imagine letting go of the categories of male, female, men, women, even race, is that so much violence has been meted out due to these categorizations, due to the oppressions and the power relations that come from creating differences between people, that some folk only feel comfortable. Some women only want to be with women or spend time with women because of the threat of male violence. Or some, I think we're really sort of seeing this at the moment in the United States. I've seen it quite a lot online. Like, some Black Americans only want to spend time with Black Americans. The Black Panthers were very sort of big on that as well. They wanted to support Black writers, Black thinkers, Black musicians, Black artists, because of the violence that they had suffered at the hands of whites. And it's completely understandable. So I suppose, how do we begin to dismantle these categories when now there's an element of safety in the very thing which keeps us apart?
I don't know if it's a really question of safety, and this way of thinking, even though I understand it and I respect it, and sometimes I share it, but actually, if we really think that sex, race, and class are interlocking systems, anyway, if there are only women, let's say, between these women only, classism and racism exist and cause different kinds of violences. Or even if we are a group of so-called Indian indigenous people only, I mean, there are men and women, and there might exist also richer and poorer, which also would create different kinds of power relation and possibly violence. So this is part of the answer. And the other part of the answer is, even though these divides are not based on a real natural difference, the social differences that have been created totally justify that we, on one level, stick to these categories, because these categories are socially real. The point is not is that they're not biologically real, but socially and politically they have real effects. So we have to do something with these real effects, even though the cause is not biology. This is the important switch. We have to understand these categories are not biologically real, but they have been naturalized. But even though they are not based on nature or biology, they have political, real, concrete, material effects that we have to address. So this ambiguity or this duality is a bit like tricky, and we have to figure it out. And then, then again, all these categories are crossed by other categories, which complicate them quite a lot. And if you try to have people only of one category, I mean, you very quickly get to groups with only one person in the group. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Sorry, the
Go
other
on.
thing I wanted to say is precisely race is very also ambiguous, even though it's supposed to be, if we have the black and white example of the United States, it's supposed to be more or less clear. But actually, indeed, being white or being black is totally depends on the context, on the place, and on the moment. And this is the question of the one-drop rule, for instance, which didn't exist all the time, but which produces people that are really very like light-skinned, for instance. And a person who doesn't know this kind of the question of one-drop rule would think this person is white. And that's why the passing exists in the United States. There are people that are called black, but in their appearance, I mean, it's a social convention, actually, or it's a social enforcement to say this person or this person is of this racial position or this other racial position. And one interesting thing about the one drop rule and about indigenous people is, for instance, in Virginia, as you might have read in the book, in my book, in Virginia, the whole elite comes from the guy, the colonizer. But the colonizer had one child with an indigenous woman called Pocahontas in the popular way. So all this elite has indigenous blood. And so, because of the one drop rule, should be considered not as white, neither as mestizo, should be considered as Indian. But not, because they are the elite. And between these people, Nancy Reagan is one of them. And Nancy Reagan couldn't possibly be an indigenous person, could she? But by their own rules, which are also absurd, she should be considered as indigenous. And you and me probably, as not from the United States, we would consider maybe that she is of mixed descent. And white supremacists would maybe think that she's purely white because the most important is her father's blood. Different social and cultural ways of defining what is race position of people. It's not natural either, not biological.
There's another layer I want to get in here just before we end this conversation, which is about this connection as well between how people perceive race and gender and how they perceive animals and nature. And there's been really interesting research only done in the past sort of 5 years that shows that men who have more of a I write about this in my book. So first of all, men that perceive women as being like closer to mother nature, to nature as this sort of feminized concept, have a more positive view of them, but that positive view of them is colored by a sense of them being like weak or in need of defense, which is of course sexist. Um, and then also there's a connection between how white people view other human beings of a different skin color as being closer to animals or not, and essentially the relationship to animals then coloring their relationship to people of color, and then that reinforcing itself as well, and then men that associate women more with animals having more violent urges towards them, and having much more negative thoughts of sexism towards women, just seeing them as lesser beings. And I think it's very, very interesting in everything that we're discussing as well, because you've woven the natural world in. It also goes to this next step of how is it that we see other beings, as you said at the beginning of this conversation, and how that then informs along the chain into human beings and outwards into Earth, and what bodies we see as exploitable, oppressible, as having our right to dominate over, and how that perception, which is ultimately a violent one, can never be contained to just that body. It always seeps out into the bodies that just don't look like ours. And that's it at the end of the day. And I find that to be a really, really important. And this is why this conversation is so important, because getting to grips with heterosexism, heteropatriarchy, racism, colonialism, it doesn't just heal our relationship towards each other or promote the possibilities of different modes of social organization within humans, it also reveals a different path to relating to the wider world, which will then reinforce a different way of relating to each other as well as humans.
Exactly. Also, the divide between human beings and other beings is totally other cultures
Completely.
see things like that, and they are not able to separate. This is a human, and this is the rest not human. I mean, and by the way, as human, we are composed of many other beings. Let's say,
Yeah.
yeah, in our stomach and all the stuff. I mean, without all these beings, we couldn't even eat. And
Yeah.
eat, but we couldn't digest. So the limits that we are so used to draw between I something which is not I, or between human and something which is not human, or between me and the rest. I mean, this is totally cultural, social, historical. I mean, there are many other things to understand, but the way we understand is very deeply molded by capitalist mode of production, heterosexist mode of production, colonial racial mode of production, all interconnected, interlocking. So yeah, we it's not so easy, but we really should try to make an effort to like start questioning the evidences, the way we think our categories, which are all very, very, I mean, arbitrary and contextual and in a context, in a social, cultural, historical context.
A big part of your book that we haven't gone on to is about the production of children. And I really want to touch on that before we wrap up. And obviously you've kind of mentioned it and woven it through as you've been speaking about, why should the most important part of our sociality be about the production of our progeny? And I completely agree with you. Um, but what is it about the way that we categorize the production of children that is useful to capitalist production?
Well, this is a complex question, and in my book, I also insist on all the children who are destroyed because we for different reasons in different historical context, children are not necessarily welcome, and the idea is not to maximize population.
Yep.
I mean,
Maximize.
in some conceptions of society, of power, of whatever, the point, this is explained by Nira Yuval Davis, for instance. She explains it very well in her book about gender nation. In some moments, I mean, the important is being many people. For instance, when you're going to wage a war in which soldiers would be important, because now with drones, it may be different. In some occasions, I mean, we have to be many people. So this implies certain kind of organization of procreation, especially for women. No? Then, example, France, after the First World War, the French government prohibited the information to anti-contraception and abortion.
Contraception.
So,
Wow.
and this lasted 50 years because supposedly, in the opinion of the French state and government, French people have to be very numerous, and so women should produce these French people in order to wage war to Germany. Well,
Yeah.
50 years of suffering, you know, which is not so much in comparison to other groups, but by the way. Then another way of thinking is, on the contrary, we should not be so many people because, I mean, for instance, a planet will not be able to.
Finite resources.
Exactly. This is another way of thinking, which also is historical. And in general, in this way of thinking, actually the others shouldn't be so many. We should do
Yeah.
right. Limitation of population, and it's also Mantus, very well known. And the third way of thinking to population is to say we should be either more or less, but the most important is the composition of this population, the quantity, and this is eugenicism. Maybe we should be only black people, or only white people, or only men, or only, I mean, this is another way, another way, only a female, male. Anyway, or we shouldn't have any people with Down syndrome, all this kind of, this is a eugenist way of thinking to population. So with these three different ways of thinking what population should be, if we should be more or less or of a certain type, this produces totally different, um, and capitalism can use these three ways of, I mean, it can be important to have more people, less people, or special kind of people. So this is to start also questioning the idea that, for instance, capitalism always need more people to have this army of a reserve, or I don't know how it's called in English.
Reserve army.
Yeah, reserve army. It's not the case all the time. This can be, and this is something I question in my books. Precisely. Sometimes, or in some conditions, maybe reserve army is important, and other times it's not the main point. And in other situational moments, it's another logics which prevails. And also, for instance, mm, part of the children production or creation or fabrication, or I don't know how to call it. It's not necessarily production in a capitalist way of thinking or in a capitalist register, vocabulary register. I mean, many children are produced outside of the capitalist logics, outside in terms of time period. I mean, when capitalist mode of production was not so globalized, I mean, there were many places in which children were produced not for capitalist reasons, and still now, probably, there are many children produced in other circumstances and with other logics. Probably now it's less because capitalist mode of production has become quite global. But even though, so we probably it's an error to think everything is organized by a strict capitalist logics. This is one point. And what else could be said? Yeah, this is another, my whole point is trying to think away from the admitted logics of naturalization, of race, of sex, of everything, and also the admitted logics of children production as something natural. It's totally not natural, and the fact that children could be considered as a blessing, for instance, is totally specific to certain moments and certain places. And so there are many children who are being destroyed, some before, I mean, they're not even children, but I mean, there's a lot of abortion and controlled abortion of this or this kind of fetuses, etc. And then when children are born, I mean, because before they're not children, we're not, not Catholic against abortion, but babies that are born, many of the babies are condemned to death very, very quickly and are destroyed either by, for instance, the Nazis. They kill hundreds, thousands of children. But there are other examples. I mean, not every baby or future child is welcome, either by the parents or by other social instances. And there are states who condemn, I mean, and another example, even though it's quite different, is in China with the politics of only one child. During many years, there were families who had a baby girl and simply didn't care so much for her in order to get rid of her and have another baby. And this is not it's China. It's because, I mean, not every child is well considered by different actors, social actors, and is not going to become adult and productive adult or workforce. Somehow,
Yeah.
heavy conversation, but
No, but it's an important one. I think it's a very important. I do think it's an important one on a finite planet. Listen, I do ascribe to the point that our population is going to have to come down. I just don't want it to be some sort of centralized force that organizes it. And I'm very happy to see in richer nations who have really high material footprints that these high levels of education typically are facilitating women having smaller family sizes and finally having choice, which has been removed from them for the past 500 years over the sizes of their families and what they do with their bodies. I think that that is wonderful, especially on a planet that is actively running out of resources.
but
But I think,
sorry, may I say something? The main
please.
consumers of resources and the main producers of trash and pollution are the armies. French army, army, Israeli army, Russian army. These armies are consuming the resources, not the people, the armies.
But but the army is made up of people in the same way that the economy is made up of people. And so if we have less people, then we will have less economic growth, which will trigger either, a recession, or it will trigger a sort of managed decline, which will ensure either that authoritarian governments come to the fore and leave their populations behind and just to put all of their money into these like very aggressive, violent technologies, which may very well be the way that it goes, or that they will have to implement different modes of thought like degrowth, décroissance, and begin to equitably manage their resources, which will mean that less is going into violent technologies. So, like at the end of the day, like how many human bodies there are does absolutely matter to what is going on economically and what a nation state, what all of these conceptual ideas are capable of doing or making decisions about. But I think that there's another very human reason why this is so important, this conversation now. And that is especially in the West, where we have this sort of like crisis of meaning, crisis of spirituality, crisis of whatever it is that you want to talk about. And people, I think one of the few things that people are, I hope I don't get in trouble. Listen, everybody, don't judge too fast. But I think one of the few things that people are still doing without really thinking too much about is reproducing, having children. And perhaps in the hope that it will provide some purpose, some meaning, some direction, something to do, connection with a partner, or, revive a marriage that is dying. I hear that's a very common thing. And to me, it's an astonishing thing because it's it's the most non-consensual thing I think a human being is capable of doing. And I really mean what I say there. Maybe I'd have to think about whether murder meets it, but it is ultimately the most non-consensual thing that you are doing, bringing another human being into this world that has not asked to be here, that has not chosen the conditions within which it will grow up, the family within which it will grow up, and the life that it will lead. And a huge number of other things that are completely out with your own control. So you're rolling the dice essentially on the existence of another person. And if you're, and it's, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be rolling the dice on that. You need to really, really either want to do it or maybe even not know what you're doing, know the reality of the situation, and try to ensure that you are going to provide the best possible environment essentially within which that other human being that didn't ask to be here, as all teenagers like to scream at their parents, to grow. And I think that that is extremely important. And the way that children's bodies are used as this psychological salve for adults, I think is emblematic of the way that we rip up other bodies of the earth and destroy other bodies of our earth, our kinfolk, in order to put a psychological salve on our weary, heavy, broken, scared hearts and minds. I really do. Whether it's like going on a shopping spree and buying like 100 euros worth of fast fashion, which will have caused a huge amount of waste and been made with very, very cheap, if not slave labor, and have destroyed huge swathes of the earth. Whether it's stuffing your face with, the 3 McDonald's cheeseburgers, which are helping facilitate this violent production of animal bodies for, cheap things that light up our dopamine receptors on fire. I mean, it's I don't mean to make light of, what children are for some people, but that is what it is for some other people. And I think that it's part and parcel of the same problem. Yeah.
I think it has to do, and even if we have to contextualize also this, but yeah, I mean, producing children is complicated, but many times it's done like very short moment without guaranteeing the conditions. But also, and that's what I try to explain in my book, in many times, in many occasions, women are not willing to produce these children. And male and men are not thinking so much about what is going to happen either. It's not a question of generalizing, because precisely in the book I try to explain how complicated it is, and how many people don't have the right to, and how many people are forced to, and how they are forced to, and by who they are forced to, and what can they do even if they have been forced to try to restore some better situation for the children and for themselves, especially women. People consider that women, but I mean, it's very unnatural. It's very cultural, historical, geographical. This is a very it's totally unnatural. I mean, this is the main point, and in this point, I totally agree with what you said. It's presented as natural and beautiful, and it's not. I mean, it can be, but
It can be. It can be for people that choose for it to be that way. And I think that is what and it's difficult, right? There's not many people not everyone gets to choose. And I think that's part of what we're talking about. And I interviewed a woman, a feminist permaculturalist recently, Cara Hunterman. We had a really good conversation. And in it, she told the story of when she was raped as a young woman and she fell pregnant and she decided to keep the child. And she said a lot of her leftist friends abandoned her because they thought she was making the wrong decision. But she had this child, and she said, having this child has informed my politics. It's informed how I work the land. It's informed what the way that I teach, how I think about the future, et cetera, et cetera. And it was really interesting, and it was such a beautiful example, I think, of someone who didn't get to choose at all. This like violent non-consensual act, didn't get to choose, and they made an active choice with what was she was left with, essentially. And it took such emotional maturity and also intellectual strength, I think, to arrive there. And this is
let's not forget that many women in history or history were raped by their husbands and were forced to have all the children they had, or almost all the children that they had. They were forced to have them. I mean, that the one situation of the woman you said, with slight differences, but not so many differences. And so they have been so intelligent, mature, and able to cope with that.
Completely. I mean, the strength that you find at rock bottom, I think that the rock bottom of her story, the strength that you find in it is absolutely, it's amazing. And yet, just because it's there doesn't mean that women should be forced through it, essentially. And I think that is what's so interesting about this moment still seeing articles published in papers like the New York Times. Am I selfish for not having children? Which is I've read so many articles to try and understand what this question even means in that context, and I don't get it. None of them can explain it adequately to me. The pressure that women are put on, women with, and I don't mean to qualify this as a sign of sovereignty, but women with lots of degrees, or with, that have really battened the path of their own life and decided what they want to do for themselves, and still being questioned by strangers or by their own family members when it comes to this one thing. And it's this particular, I don't know, I haven't thought about it enough, but to just sort of briefly formulate this like superiority here of the body.
Sorry, but we have to remind that also many people that we call women are, on the contrary, forced not to have children. They are sterilized by force. They cannot get married. They cannot, and if they get married, they can, or they quit. They take away their uterus because of our stupid reasons. I mean, black women in many, in the United States, let's say, or indigenous women, they suffer many, many ways of impeaching them to have children if they want. I mean, some are forced to have, others are forced not to have, and many are forced to have only this kind or that kind of children because it's the same. Maybe I decide I want to have a child and I can be free, well, but if I decide to have a child with this kind of guy, no, this other kind, no, because race, because class, because age, because legitimacy of our wedding and all this stuff. So actually, it's so complicated.
Jules, I think this is a conversation that could spiral on. And I did ask you for 10 minutes and I've taken much more from you. So my final question from you is, who would you like to platform?
Well, I would suggest, even though I'm not sure she would accept it in English, I would suggest Pochi Kuriel, who is a lesbian feminist and anti-racist and decolonial feminist of Dominican Republic, and she's living in Colombia. She has been living in Colombia for years. So I think she could be a very good person to know and meet and maybe ask for different things.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I will reach out to her. And Jules, thank you very much for your time. It was a great pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for organizing this, inviting me, and all what you do around that.
Thank you. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.